I mean, I'm just saying, if God created light on day one, but then didn't create the source of light, like the sun and stars, until a couple days later, where was the light coming from? My mom. Light was... Oh, it's a mama joke, okay. It's kind of mean, Carl. Hi, and welcome to this video lecture. Today, we're going to discuss Genesis chapters 1 and 2, the creation narratives of the Hebrew Bible. Genesis chapters 1 and 2 are part of what we call primeval history in the Hebrew Bible. Let's talk about what that term means. Primeval history refers to that which is sort of outside of history. It's about etiology, the origin of how things came to be the way they are. And it's an origin that uses myth to express its ideas. Sometimes when we hear the word myth, we think falsehood, but we shouldn't think in those terms. It is true that myth doesn't quite measure up to the notion of historical, but myth is simply a way of expressing experienced reality and cultural significance through symbolic language. In Genesis, primeval history explains a number of origins: the origin of the world, the origin of the human race, the origin of nations, and also the origin of the condition of the world, including its negative aspects. Before we dive into Genesis chapters 1 and 2 more specifically, I want to take a second to talk about the authorship of primeval history, which leads us into a broader conversation about the authorship of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Traditionally, it was held that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. There are a number of questions we can raise about this idea, including the fact that some of the Pentateuch covers history after Moses' death. But suffice it to say that the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch has been called into question by scholars. Generally speaking, scholars accept that a number of different sources have contributed to the final form of the Pentateuch. Some of them oral traditions, some of them written traditions, and then finally all of them are adapted together. The leading theory on this refers to 4 different sources that have been used to put the Pentateuch together. J, referring to the Yahweh source, E, referring to the Elohist source, D, referring to Deuteronomistic history, and P, referring to the priestly source. These sources are differentiated by when they're writing and the style or tone that they write in. For example, the Yahwist writes often using the term Yahweh, which appears in the Hebrew Bible, or the English translation of the Hebrew Bible, as the word Lord in all caps. The Elohist and the priestly author, on the other hand, use the term Elohim more frequently. You'll notice in Genesis chapter 1, God is referred to as Elohim, the Hebrew word for God, or more appropriately, gods. It's plural. But in Genesis chapter 2, you'll note that God is referred to as Lord in all caps, Yahweh. There are other reasons why people differentiate between these sources: style, content, and so on. While there are challenges to the specificity of JEDP, we're not going to go into that too closely here. There is general consensus that multiple sources have come together for the final compilation of the Pentateuch. And we have good reason to believe that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 come from separate sources. One famous biblical author, Peter Enns, summarizes this point rather well. The Pentateuch as we know it was not authored out of whole cloth by a second millennium Moses, but is the end product of a complex literary process, written, oral, or both, that did not come to a close until sometime after the return from exile. The important idea here is that the final version of the Pentateuch, the final compilation of all the sources put together into one coherent source, or semi-coherent source, didn't happen until after Israel returned from the Babylonian exile, placing it somewhere in the 5th, 4th century BCE. That gives us a broad sense of the authorship of the Pentateuch, but it also helps us explore Genesis chapters 1 and 2, since again, Genesis 1 and 2 seem to come from different sources. Let's start by taking a look at Genesis 1. It's important to note the world behind the text in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 was written and edited in a milieu of other cosmogonical myths. A cosmogony is simply a creation narrative. Genesis 1 wasn't unique as a creation myth. There were other creation myths around, even earlier than Genesis, and the authors and editors of Genesis chapter 1 drew on these myths to make their myth. Understanding these other myths help us to understand Genesis 1 better. One creation myth that has been particularly fruitful in terms of a comparative analysis is the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish. Let me summarize the contents of the Enuma Elish very quickly. The Enuma Elish depicts a world of many gods, all the offspring of Apsu and Tiamat, who themselves are gods representing the separation of water into fresh water and salt water. The gods are too loud for Apsu, who plots to kill them all. This plot is thwarted when the younger gods learn of it and kill Apsu first. When Tiamat learns of Apsu's death, and is again reminded of the noise made by the younger gods, she goes to battle against them. She also creates many monsters to help in her fight. A younger Babylonian god, Marduk, is enlisted to battle Tiamat, Marduk defeats her and uses her body to create the world. After Marduk's victory, he is crowned king of the gods. As one of his first acts, he kills Kingu, one of the gods that fought alongside of Tiamat, and uses the blood to create humans. Blood I will mass and cause bones to be. I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Truly savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they may be at ease. The Enuma Elish provides a helpful way to explore Genesis chapter 1 because it has certain similarities, but also because it has very interesting differences. Looking at the similarities and differences can help us to understand what the authors of Genesis 1 are trying to convey. Let's start by looking at the similarities. The first similarity is that creation consists of ordering a void or chaos. The second similarity is that there is a theme of separating waters. The third similarity is that the creation of the world is depicted. The fourth similarity is that the creation of human beings is depicted and explained in terms of purpose. These similarities help us to understand a common milieu of themes that are drawn upon when writing creation myths in the ancient Near East. But the differences are really what help us to understand, at least in part, how the Israelite theologians differentiated their understanding of God from the way that their neighbors understood their gods. So let's take a few more minutes to consider these differences. First, creation. In the Enuma Elish, the creation of the world follows upon warfare among the gods. There is violence. In Genesis, there is no warfare. The creation process is peaceful. Second, the world itself. In the Enuma Elish, the world is created out of a divine corpse. In Genesis, the world is formed out of a formless void, but again, there is no death in the creation of the world. The creatures within the world. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk must fight and subdue sea monsters created by Tiamat. In Genesis, God welcomes the world into the creative process, with phrases like, "Let the waters teem with life," and "Let the land produce living creatures." Furthermore, God creates space for the sea monsters, rather than subduing and defeating them. Finally, fourth, the creation of humanity. In the Enuma Elish, humans are created from the blood of a god for the purpose of servanthood to the gods, that the gods may be at ease. In Genesis, God shares the divine image with humans and empowers them to fulfill a role of leadership in the created order. Understanding these contrasts between the Enuma Elish and Genesis helps us to understand the different emphases that were being placed on God, what is God like, and what is the world like, in Babylon and in Israel. So why is that important? One reason that it's important is it helps us to understand what some of the theologians of Israel were saying with some of the words that they used in Genesis chapter 1. One of the most interesting places that we can explore this is the notion of the image of God. The notion that human beings are made in the image of God has been important for a lot of Jewish history, and really central for much Christian history in terms of Christian anthropology, or a Christian understanding of what it means to be human. However, traditionally, most theologians assume that the image of God established some essential difference between human beings and all other creatures or all other animals on the planet. One example of this is St. Augustine. Augustine writes, "God then made man in his own image. He created for him a soul endowed with reason and intelligence, so that he might excel all the creatures of the earth, air, and sea, which were not so gifted." It was very common in Christian history to assume that humanity was completely unique in the possession of rationality and in the possession of free will. These characteristics of the human being separated the species from all other species on the planet. We see this in major figures in Christian history like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and it continues today in many interpretations. We can ask a number of questions about this interpretation. Does science actually support the idea that humans are unique in these capacities? But let's set that aside for a moment and focus on a more basic question. Does the text itself of Genesis 1 support this interpretation? Interestingly enough, if you read Genesis 1, you'll note there is no mention of an essentially unique characteristic that humans possess that no other creatures possess. There's no mention of rationality or free will or intelligence, or even no mention of the uniqueness of a human soul. Indeed, the only difference that's mentioned in Genesis chapter 1 is that human beings are made in the image of God. So what does it mean to be made in the image of God? Well, we need to break this down to two basic features. One, what does it mean to bear an image? And two, what does it mean to bear the image of a particular God? In this case, Elohim. Let's take a look at the idea of image first. The idea of image is where Christian theologians have tended to think rationality and free will differentiate humans from all other creatures. But in ancient Near Eastern culture, the notion of image had different connotations. connotations. In Mesopotamian cultures, for example, the king bore the image of God, and the idea was that the king was endowed with a responsibility to rule in God's place, or to represent God on earth. This fits very nicely with the world behind the text in Genesis chapter 1, the ancient Near East, but it also makes sense of the text itself. Right after human beings are given the image of God, God says, "Be fruitful, multiply, rule over all the creatures, and subdue the earth." There's a role involved in bearing the image, a role of kingship or rulership or representation of God's will on earth. In this sense, biblical scholars have tended to think that the notion of the image of God is more functional than substantialistic. What I mean by that is, rather than referring to some essential substance that makes humans different from all other creatures on the planet, it refers rather to a unique role that is given to human beings, and that role is dominion. Now this complicates things a bit further, because oftentimes dominion has been read as the right to do what we want to other creatures of the planet, to kill them for food, to wear them as clothes, so on and so forth. So another question comes up: does the text support this idea? Now this is where we have to move from the idea of what it means to be made in the image of something to ask the other question: whose image does humanity bear? In this case, it's the god Elohim. Now let's take a step back and consider what we just said about the differentiation between Marduk and Elohim. Elohim's creation is peaceful. Elohim's creation is other-affirming. Elohim's creation shares power rather than lording it over. These ideas don't necessarily support a violent or utilitarian understanding of the image of God. It rather supports the idea that the dominion of human beings should represent the kind of God whose image humanity bears. This peaceful God, Elohim. And let me make a quick side note here. Just because I'm saying in Genesis chapter 1 that God is peaceful, doesn't mean that I'm saying that God is peaceful throughout the entire Hebrew scripture or throughout the entire Bible. There are plenty of times that God will throw down. Next week we're going to talk about the flood in Genesis chapter 6, where God kills really most of the creatures on the planet. And as we all know, Carl, that's what happened to the dinosaurs. They forgot to show up to Noah's Ark, and that's why they died. But in Genesis chapter 1, where the notion of the image of God is mentioned, Elohim is presented in this peaceful differentiation from Marduk's violence. It's no surprise then that right after humanity, made in the image of God, is given this command to have dominion over all creatures of the earth, there is another verse that restricts what humans can do to these creatures. In Genesis chapter 1:29, humanity is given vegetation for food. But just vegetation, and actually just seed-bearing vegetation for food. And indeed, all creatures of the earth are only given vegetation for food. Later, in Genesis chapter 9, human beings are also allowed to consume meat. But in Genesis 1, where the image of God is mentioned, they are not allowed to consume meat. That's off the table. In Genesis chapter 9, they go full like Uruk-Urukai and like the Two Towers.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys.
But it is interesting to note that the notion of image of God and the notion of dominion, understood functionally, doesn't really allow for that kind of violent use of other creatures. This leads us to a question: how should we understand the notion of the image of God today? Well, maybe rather than jumping to the conclusion that dominion means we can do whatever we want, even violent use of other creatures, we should consider the idea in light of where it falls in Genesis 1 and in light of the world behind the text of Genesis 1. Particularly that differentiation between Marduk in the Enuma Elish and Elohim in Genesis 1. This raises an interesting question for us: the notion that God's creation is fundamentally relational. It's about how things are interconnected and how creatures interact with one another. This theme is actually picked up in Genesis chapter 2. Genesis 2 is thought to have been written by the J source, the Yahweh source. And this source, generally speaking, is thought to have been written earlier than P. Though there's a lot of debate about this, so I'm not going to focus too much on the world behind the text in Genesis chapter 2. But I do want to mention quickly a few points in Genesis chapter 2 that I think are worth exploring. 4 things in particular demonstrate this notion of relationality in God's creation. First, God creates Adam and places him in a garden to till and to keep it. Adam's existence, his own identity, is tied to a role of caring for the garden. And there's a sense in which we can say the garden doesn't simply exist for Adam, that Adam and the garden exist for one another. Second, Adam is considered to be alone in the garden, even though Adam is in communion with God. In other words, God appears to be not enough for Adam. So God decides to create Adam a helper. The Hebrew word here is ezer. I'll return to this in a second. But the point here is that Adam is alone and needs other companions to fulfill him. Generally speaking, we always think, okay, then God created Eve. But before God creates Eve, God creates all the other animals to be companions for Adam. And it's interesting to note that in Genesis chapter 2, again, the animals are not created to be food or to be slaves or to be clothes. They're created to be companions, helpers alongside of Adam in his task of caring for the garden. And the fourth thing that I want to mention has to do with Adam and his relationship to Eve. It's often assumed that in the Bible, Eve is subordinate to Adam, especially because the word helper is used to describe Eve. But again, here it's important to note that the Bible was not written in English. It was written in Hebrew, a bit of Aramaic, and the New Testament in some Greek. And the Hebrew word here, ezer, doesn't necessarily have the same connotation of the English word helper for many people. When people think of the word helper, they do think of someone subordinate, right? Like a magician with his helper, someone who's second hand, the Robin to my Batman, so to speak, in the team, but subordinate, not the main character. However, it's interesting to note that the term ezer doesn't really support this interpretation. In all of the Hebrew scriptures, the word ezer appears 21 times. And most of those times, the word ezer refers not to a human being, but to God. For example, in Psalm chapter 70, verse 5, the text states, "I am poor and needy. Hasten to me, O God. You are my help and my deliverer. O Lord, do not delay." It would therefore be strange to think that ezer means subordinate, unless it means that God is subordinate to those God is helping. In other cases, the term ezer is used to describe the relationship between equals, for instance, equal political powers helping one another in a situation. Again, subordination is not implied. So why then is it so often assumed that in Genesis chapter 2, ezer means that the woman is subordinate to the man? Well, one of the main reasons I think has to do with the world in front of the text, that many readers of the world were reading it in a patriarchal society, and the assumption was that women were less than men. Now, there are many patriarchal notions in the Bible which have been fed into culture. Now, culture, influenced by these patriarchal notions, reads them back into the Bible, even where they might not be there. And Genesis chapter 2 is one example of this. But considering the Hebrew word ezer, there's no reason to assume that there's any subordination going on. Eve and Adam are presented as equals. It's not until Genesis chapter 3, after Adam and Eve eat from the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, that Eve is told that she will be subordinate to her husband. But it's interesting to note that this is a result of something that has gone wrong with God's creation, not the original intention of it. Stepping back and looking at Genesis chapters 1 and 2, you do get an image of a relational creation, an interconnected reality in which Adam is alone without the other animals and without Eve, in which Adam and the garden exist for one another, in which human beings bearing the image of God exist in some sense for the benefit of other creatures, to represent the peaceful rule of Elohim on earth. These readings can very likely help us today address things like the way that human beings treat the planet, the way that human beings treat other species. It can provide us with an impetus to rethink the relationship between human beings and the rest of the created order, and perhaps even remember that we are in fact part of the created order, and meant to represent God within the created order. Perhaps we should implement a strange golden rule that would apply here. Since we bear the image of God, and we are God's representative on earth, we should only do to those creatures that are lesser than us as we would want God, who is greater than us, to do unto us. That leads to a rather strange question. If God treated human beings the way that human beings treat other animals on the planet, will this be good news or bad news? If it would be bad news, let's ask the question, are we really then bearing the image of this particular God? But don't be too distraught about this. Again, next week we're going to look at the flood narrative, where God does a lot of violence and destroys a lot of things. So maybe there's hope for humanity yet. Who knows? Look on the sunny side, always on the sunny side. See, Carl, I'm an optimist. God can kill everything on the planet? Image of God. Seriously, don't do that though. Until next time, farewell.